This is Nescafe. In the Philippines, it's hard not to see Nescafe everywhere. And I'm not sure about you, but I used to think that Nescafe invented instant coffee. But once again, I was wrong. They didn't invent instant coffee. Instant coffee was already around for years before Nescafe came in. But because of Nescafe, it's everywhere. And when Nescafe arrived here in the Philippines, they dominated. Although there were other players, since Nescafe is a part of Nestle, they simply outgunned everyone. But there was one brand that became a surprising challenger, and they actually beat Nescafe in a particular category. That brand is Copico. Now, this is a two-parter video, okay? In this video, I'm gonna talk about the crazy history of instant coffee and the origins of Nescafe, and how difficult it was to create the perfect instant coffee that even Nestle almost gave up. It just so happened that there was this one scientist who kept working on it even though the project was shut down. And in the next video, I'm gonna talk about the origin story of Copico and how they took the lead from Nescafe here in the Philippines. My name is Chris, welcome to Brand Origins. This episode was made possible by The Sauce. The Sauce is the only news page that I can actually keep up with because honestly, I don't really have the time to consume these long news reports, but I still want to get updated. And that's why I like The Sauce, because they make this easy to consume with their visuals that are clear, short, and straight to the point. And I can stay updated without leaving Instagram. It's bite-sized news that cuts through all the noise. So follow them. It's at thesauce.ph on Instagram. The links are in the description. You know, when I was a kid, when the word coffee was mentioned, to me, it meant Nescafe. That's what coffee meant to me because that's what my parents had at home. Starbucks coffee runs weren't a thing yet, at least not here in Iloilo, or at least that's not what my family did here. I would see my parents take their coffee and it seemed like all they needed was hot water, sugar, and a pack of Nescafe. Like that's it, that's the coffee experience. And I think for most Filipinos that time, that's what coffee meant for them too. Back then, coffee was simpler because it had to be. I mean, sure, espresso machines and coffee makers, they were already around that time, but they weren't as accessible or affordable as they are today. And we also didn't have YouTube to teach us all about the nuances of making great coffee at home. So we learned to love what we had. All we had was hot water, sugar, creamer, and Nescafe. Because if you wanted coffee in the morning, Nescafe was it. And so it made me wonder, why is Nescafe the biggest brand of instant coffee, not only here in the Philippines, but in so many countries around the world? Did they invent instant coffee? Well, no, because way before Nestle came into the picture, there were already several attempts to make coffee more convenient. The first version of instant coffee came from the UK in 1771. Back then, they referred to it simply as coffee compound. I don't know exactly how it tasted like, but I can imagine that it wasn't great. In 1851, during the Civil War, Americans came up with their own version of instant coffee. They referred to it simply as coffee cakes. It wasn't anything fancy, but when soldiers were sent out to war, when they were in the middle of the battlefield, far from home, in freezing temperatures, having something warm to drink, even if it tasted so bad, it was more than enough. They could turn a blind eye on the taste if it meant that, even just for a moment, they could stay warm and feel mentally alert. Even though these coffee cakes tasted so bad, it did the job. Now let's fast forward 39 years later. In 1890, there was this guy from New Zealand. His name was David Strang. David Strang was trying to create a better way of making instant coffee. And so he came up with this method called as the dry hot air method. And he patented this. And this might actually be considered as the world's first proper instant coffee. And when I mean proper, I'm not saying that it tastes great. I'm just saying that it probably tastes so much better than the horrible tasting coffee cakes. 11 years after David Strang's version of instant coffee, there was Satori Caro. Satori Caro was a Japanese-American chemist based in Chicago. He created a more stable and more enjoyable version of instant coffee. He got it patented in 1903 and he even showed it off at the Pan-American Exposition. And so for a while, people actually thought that Satori Caro invented instant coffee until they discovered that David Strang from New Zealand had patented a version of instant coffee 11 years earlier. Now, these attempts in making instant coffee, these were good starting points, but they weren't good enough yet to commercially mass produce. And there weren't any brands yet that felt confident enough that it was good enough and good tasting enough for people to want to buy. But all of that changed when this guy came along. His name was George Washington. This isn't the George Washington you have in your mind, okay? This George Washington was a Belgian-American inventor, and one time, while he was in Guatemala, while waiting for his coffee to be ready, he found himself noticing the dried coffee residue forming on this silver pot of coffee. And although it's something that everyone else has seen before and is honestly nothing extraordinary, for George Washington, it's like a lightning bolt snapped an idea in his mind. Because he was looking at this and he was like, I think there's something here. Maybe we can do something with this. It was his eureka moment. He rushed back to his kitchen and got to work. And after several rounds of trial and error, he came up with a new way to make instant coffee. This led to the creation of Ready Coffee. Ready Coffee is considered as the first mass-produced instant coffee in the US. So George Washington launched the company and he was working on figuring out how to get Ready Coffee all over the US. And the timing couldn't be more perfect because around this time, World War II happened. Since George Washington's coffee was considered ahead of its time back then, the US military chose George Washington's company as the main supplier of coffee and they made it a part of their rations. And these are mostly staples that are pre-packaged such as canned meat, biscuits, and in this case, it now included George Washington's coffee. The Canadian Expeditionary Force made it a part of their rations in 1914, followed by the American Expeditionary Force when they finally entered the war in 1917. Eventually, this would all be allocated to the US military because of their incredible demand for coffee, which at the final stage of the war was around 6 times the national supply. Oh, here's something interesting. So you know how people call a cup of coffee cup of joe? So, well, there's a theory that it actually started with George Washington's coffee. They say that back then, soldiers would refer to their coffee as Cup of George since it's from George Washington's coffee. And over time, they say that George got shortened to Joe. So instead of Cup of George, it's just now Cup of Joe. Some say that it came from a time when the US Navy banned alcohol on their ships. And so since there was no alcohol, they had to make do with coffee. And then they started associating coffee as being the drink of the common man or the average Joe, so Cup of Joe. And then there's also the G.I. Joe theory. And then there's a theory where it came from a popular New York coffee shop in New York owned by Joe Martinson, and so Cup of Joe. But going back, so coffee's impact in battle, it was pretty big. And you can't really underestimate what coffee meant to soldiers. I mean, there are letters out there of soldiers wishing for the well-being of Mr. George Washington. And I get it. I guess when you're stuck in the trenches with mud, rats, explosions all around you, sometimes all you have for comfort is this hot drink. And so since soldiers would see this coffee experience as a small escape, and since they would experience this regularly, even though they would still sometimes describe it as something that didn't taste amazing, it became more than just a drink. It became a routine. And this routine became a habit that they brought home with them when the war ended. This actually reminds me of the story of Spam. I made a video about this before. Most of these soldiers got introduced to Spam. Some of them, not really by choice, they didn't really have a choice but to eat it because that's part of the rations. And because of this, they got hooked. And so when the war ended, they brought home that love of Spam with them. The same thing happened with George Washington's coffee, but it didn't quite experience the same success as Spam. Even though the coffee was something they would take regularly, there was still so much room for improvement. I mean, a lot of people still hated the taste, and a lot of them still preferred having their coffee the usual way. So the company really wasn't able to sustain their initial success, and so they would eventually be sold to Wyeth, which would eventually be acquired by Nestle. But Nestle acquiring them wasn't how Nestle got into the instant coffee game. It was much more difficult than that. Now, while all of that was happening, while instant coffee was still kind of like this half-baked idea floating around. At this point, Nestle still wasn't doing anything coffee-related yet. They were mostly known for milk products and baby food. Nestle started way back in the 1860s when Henry Nestle came up with a milk-based product that became very popular because that baby formula actually saved the life of a premature infant. Now, this is good and all, but it's not until 1905 when Nestle merged with Anglo-Swiss when they really started growing into a global food giant. But still, nothing coffee-related. And this brings us to 1929. This is when the Great Depression happened and it hit financial markets really hard. And it was bad. Businesses collapsed, people lost their savings overnight, and so many countries got into a lot of financial trouble. And this brings us to Brazil. Brazil was and still is the largest coffee producer in the world. And Brazil's economy, it was very reliant with coffee exports to the United States, which was its biggest market. Back then, it made up over 50% of all of Brazil's exported goods. That is a big number. And honestly, it's pretty scary for a country to do this because it means that all their eggs are in one basket. And I guess it's all fine until something happens to that basket. And in this case, the Great Depression happened. And the Great Depression was pretty much just their worst nightmare coming to fruition. And so when markets crashed, exports crashed as well. And since they were exporting these massive amounts of coffee to the US could no longer afford this. And so suddenly Brazil found itself with so much coffee it couldn't sell. Out of nowhere, there was this huge oversupply of coffee. And so what happens when there's so much supply and so little demand? The price of coffee collapsed. It took a nosedive. It came to a point where the price of coffee was just 10% of what it cost before the markets collapsed. So that's like you paying 10 pesos for what used to be a 100 peso coffee order. So since there was an oversupply, Brazil was like, okay, what do we do now? We have so much coffee we can't sell. We have an oversupply. How do we stop the oversupply? Prices are going down because we have too much coffee. What if we just get rid of the coffee? What if we just burn the coffee? And that's exactly what they did. The Brazilian government bought up all the excess beans and destroyed them just to drive prices back up. Some were dumped into the ocean, some were set on fire. It didn't matter. They just needed to get rid of them. Between 1931 and 1934, they destroyed over a quarter of their coffee supply every year. That's a lot of coffee beans going to waste. And sadly, even that didn't work. Prices stayed low, farmers went bankrupt, and this whole thing became an infamous example of how not to fix your economy. But here's where the story starts to shift. With all this excess coffee going to waste, Brazil went desperate, and so they were looking for a long-term solution that could finally fix all of this. And so they looked into this one company who was already known for food preservation. A company that was big enough to handle the scale and volume that Brazil was dealing with. And that company was Nestle. And somewhere in their Swiss headquarters was this young food chemist. Around this time, he recently just joined the team. His name was Max Morgenthaler. Now, originally, Max was brought in to work on vitamins in dairy products. But in 1932, Nestle's management team gave him a new mission. We have a lot of coffee, like a lot of coffee, but we don't know what to do with it. So we need you to turn all that coffee into powder. Powder that won't expire, at least something that won't expire for a long time. And most importantly, one that actually tastes and smells like real coffee. Some of them have found a way to preserve this thing, but none of them have figured out how to make it taste good and smell good. And so Max Morgenthaler understood the assignment and he went straight to work. I know this sounds simple, but at this point, this was something that no one has figured out yet. All previous attempts had one major flaw, the aroma. Since all the other attempts resulted in coffee losing its smell, it just didn't hit right. Once the aroma was gone, it made everything feel off and the experience just wasn't the same. So for the next few years, Morgenthaler and his team kept grinding away. With all the resources that Nestle had, they were able to explore so many ways to bring this to life. They tried different drying methods, they tried roasting the beans in different temperatures, they used different techniques in extracting flavor and aroma, and they just kept going at it. But in August 1935, after 3 long years of experiments, there was still no breakthrough. And so Nestle were like, okay guys, good job, we gave it everything we've got, but maybe making this type of coffee just isn't possible. And then they pulled the plug and shut the project down. Now, isn't this crazy? Imagine being a company as big as Nestle with all the resources, with all the talent, expertise, and R&D, yet not being able to solve something like this. This kind of tells us how challenging it was. I guess for them, it felt like they gave it everything they had. They put in 3 years of work, but it probably felt like it was a dead end. But here's the crazy part. Even though they shut the project down, Max Morgenthaler didn't stop working on it. He knew there was something there, he just needed more time, and so he kept working on it. And he kept going, and he would work on it during his own personal time. He bought his own coffee beans, and he would tinker at home. And when they would have slow days at the lab in Nestle, they allowed him to sneak in a few hours to keep testing his theories. And so he was able to use Nestle's expensive machines and equipment. And then in April 1937, Max Morgenthaler invited Nestle's executive board for a taste test. This was it, the moment had come. He presented his creation to the board, and then 1 sip later, everyone in the room knew. He cracked it. As soon as they took that first sip, they knew because somehow the flavor held and the aroma, it stayed. And for the first time, instant coffee actually tasted and smelled like real coffee. While they were taking their coffee, they gave Max a look that said, "You actually did it." And Max Morgenthaler couldn't be prouder. This wasn't just big for Max, it was big for Nestle too, because it meant that they had a new frontier. They could expand beyond milk. But most importantly, for Max, it was vindication. And when Nestle filed the official manufacturing patent, His name was right there in black and white, credited for being the inventor of this type of instant coffee, Max Morgenthaler. After years of work, Max got the credit he deserved. His quiet persistence, it paid off, and now Nestle had something real, an instant coffee product that they can sell to the world. But you couldn't have a product without the brand name, and they didn't really overthink this. They simply were like, you know what, having this coffee at home, it's like having your own mini cafe. And so they just joined the word Nestle with cafe, and that's how we got Nescafe. Now that they had a product and a brand, the next step was to test it out because they loved Nescafe, but they weren't really sure if the rest of the world would as well. They would do a test run in Switzerland because that's where their HQ was located. And so in 1937, it finally hit the shelves. When they were thinking of which audiences to target, they zeroed in on single men and middle-class housewives. And that because of their instant coffee, single men can finally make coffee without the help of a woman. And when it came to the middle-class housewives, their whole idea just revolved around how women no longer had to worry about making the perfect cup of coffee when guests would drop by. And so they would run entire marketing campaigns targeting these two demographics. They gave free samples to mountaineers, yachtmen, Boy Scouts, night workers, basically anyone who wanted something warm in places where an actual coffee pot may not exactly be practical. And it worked because people loved how easy it was, and most importantly, people actually loved the taste of the coffee. And because of this, Nestle felt confident enough about their product and decided that it was time to launch Nescafe in all the markets that they were already in globally. But then, war broke out, and not just any war, it was World War II. I know that war isn't something to get excited about, but while everyone else was dreading what this conflict was gonna bring, Nestle had its eyes on one thing, and that was to be part of the rations that's gonna fuel the armies heading to war. But the difference between this and World War I was the scale of this was just unheard of. Armies were much bigger, so much more manpower was involved, and so these vast war machines needed more rations, more food for their men, and of course, more coffee. In World War I, like we talked about earlier, we talked about how George Washington's coffee had a near monopoly in supplying the armies with their coffee. But in World War II, it was just on a different level. There was no one company that could single-handedly supply coffee for all these armies. And so they brought in several companies and combined their entire production capacity so that they could supply the sheer number of men who needed rations. In 1 year alone, the US military bought over 1 million cases of coffee from Nescafe. And just to give you an idea of how big an order that was every single can of coffee that Nestle's US factory could produce that year. In fact, they had nothing left for civilians. Nescafe wasn't just a drink anymore, it was fuel for the war effort. Being a part of the war rations was incredibly important for Nescafe because for them, this was their battlefield. They were very much aware that they had the opportunity to get tens of millions of army men to try their products. This was a built-in audience of caffeine-deprived soldiers. And these soldiers would have this coffee every day for years and it would become their routine. And they knew that these soldiers would eventually return home and they would bring their love of their coffee home with them. The Allies didn't only win, Nescafe won as well. By the time the war ended and tens of millions returned to civilian life, the troops didn't just remember the taste, they relied on it, they needed it. They went back to their families, their jobs, their old lives, but something changed. Now they wanted the coffee that they've gotten used to. They couldn't go back because they wanted Nescafe now. And because of this, Nescafe's expansion was primed and sales started going crazy all over the world. Eventually, it made its way here in the Philippines. Nestle products were actually already available here in the Philippines as early as 1895, but it wasn't until 1911 when they would put up their first sales office here in Binondo. In 1960, Nestle partnered up with the San Miguel Corporation, and in 1962, that's when they would put up their own factory here to produce not only Nescafe, but also Nestle's other products. This is pretty common for multinational brands where they would have a product and they would partner up with a capable local company to produce and distribute these products. But here's the thing, as remarkable as Nescafe's instant coffee story was, when Nescafe arrived here in the Philippines, it wasn't actually the first instant coffee brand to pop up up here. There were already other players. Café Puro, which was introduced in 1952, was already known as the first instant coffee brand in Asia, and they were the leading brand of coffee here in the Philippines. 1 year after Nescafe's factory was set up here, Universal Robina, or URC, owned by the Gokongways, took a look at the market and realized Café Puro has a great lead, but I think we have what it takes to challenge them. And so URC launched Blend 45. They called it Blend 45 because they said that each cup contained 45 choice coffee beans. And so at one point, it was a battle between Nescafe, Café Puro, and Blend 45. The leading brand, Café Puro, used their lead to solidify the message that their coffee was the one with the rich coffee flavor and the fresh coffee aroma. And they kept hammering the whole 100% pure coffee idea. I mean, it's even there in their brand name in Café Puro. Blend 45 was the one hinging on price. It was the cheapest option available, but despite this and despite the price, it was still pretty good instant coffee. But because of their pricing strategy, they were the ones that were labeled as the Pinoy coffee. And love it or hate it, in this game, competing on price is still a very effective way to get market share. In fact, 2 years after its launch, Blend 45 took the lead from Café Puro. It was also interesting to know some of the tactics that some of these brands were using back then. Like Café Puro had this strategy where they packaged their coffee in these glass jars which had plastic caps. And what people would do was that once they were done with their coffee, they would use these glass jars as drinking glasses at home. And just like that, you now had an extra glass that you could use day to day. And this was so successful that they would even introduce entire collections. And so they would have these collections where each glass had different designs, which made you wanna get the entire set. And there were also collections where they would have these different colors. I think they call it the rainbow collection. But yeah, it was one way to get people excited about buying more. Blend 45 would eventually have their version of this, and even Nescafe followed suit. What's funny to me is that while reading about this, I was like, okay, so this strategy was something they did in the past. But then I remembered that Nescafe still does this. Like, I know that we have a couple of Nescafe mugs at home that came for free. And it's pretty smart if you think about it, because not only will you get excited to choose this brand which offered the mug or the glass jar that you wanted, once you have that mug with you at home with Nescafe's logo, you can basically put any brand of coffee in it and it would still look like it's from Nescafe. It's free advertising for them. But now let's talk about positioning, because around this time, Café Puro has pretty much owned the whole 100% pure coffee with a fresh coffee aroma position. And Blend 45 was positioning itself as the cheapest possible coffee you can get, and the whole Pinoy coffee angle. And so Nescafe had to figure out what positioning it had to go for. And so Nescafe was like, we're an international brand. We're present in so many countries all over the world. What narrative do we tell? They needed more info. And so they went to the streets. They started talking to people. They wanted to know more about how people took their coffee, their habits, what they thought about Nescafe. And one thing that stood out was that they kept associating Nescafe as something that was imported. It wasn't the main thing, but that kind of was a recurring theme that people would bring up. They would say that it was something that they were willing to try just because it came from overseas, that it was an international product. Like, without explicitly saying it, we are drawn to the pace of the Western world. And they saw that. They saw that even though we had our own ways, we were more likely to try new things if they were from foreign Western countries. And so Nescafe looked at this and thought, if people see us as this high-quality imported brand, why don't we just lean into that? Why not position Nescafe as this modern Western way of drinking coffee during a time when Filipinos were still used to whatever was available in the local market? So Nescafe understood that early. They didn't even have to fight against our existing coffee culture, because they knew that Western products carried this built-in trust. And they realized they had a unique position to take advantage of this. And so they doubled down on that positioning. When you look at their ads, you wouldn't think that these were ads for the Philippine market, because they were using foreigners on their ads. And you would see these ads feature places from Europe and the United States. I mean, nowadays, when you're making ads, you try to at least look for Filipino-looking models so that they look relatable. But that time, Nescafe was intentionally choosing non-Filipino models on their ads. Instead of trying to beat Blend 45 on price, Nescafe doubled down on the whole international image. They wanted to paint this image that Nescafe was the coffee that people drank in the great cities of the world. That was the name of their campaign, the Great Cities of the World campaign, which ran in the 1970s. So they would get clips of people drinking coffee in the the streets of Japan, in Madrid, in France, ended with a scene in Manila with our own local version. And the message was simple. The same coffee that they're drinking, it's now available here. For Filipino viewers in the 70s and 80s, this ad hit different. Like you're not just drinking local instant coffee, you're connected to something bigger. It's like Nescafe was saying, hey, you see these people in these foreign countries enjoying your coffee? You're now part of this world too. And the strategy worked so well that they kept evolving it. And it started to work because Filipinos started seeing Nescafe as international. And after they nailed the message, they just needed to broadcast it to the entire country. Luckily, when you're backed by the world's largest food and beverage company, it means you have a multi-billion-dollar machine behind you. And so, when it came to advertising, Nestle doesn't really hold back. In 2001, they poured $30 million into a single global Nescafe campaign. By 2009, that had nearly doubled to $55.9 million. And last year, we don't have the numbers for Nescafe specifically, but Nestle as a whole spent more than 8% of its total sales on advertising and marketing. And that's coming from a company that had sales of over $104 billion in 2024. With a budget that massive, Nestle can pretty much blanket TV screens, radios, buses, billboards, and today, every social feed you scroll through. Once you nail the message, it's really just a matter of volume and consistency. And over time, that's how Nescafe made itself into the default choice. But Nescafe wasn't done building. By the 1960s, most of the world has recovered from World War II. Economy stabilized, middle classes grew, and for the first time in decades, people could now afford more than just the basics. And Nescafe saw that people started wanting these little luxuries. It wasn't that people were looking for something extravagant, it's just that they wanted to make the day-to-day just a little bit more elevated. And that's where Nescafe Gold comes in. It looked richer, it smelled fresher, and it came in a gold packaging that signaled premium quality. This wasn't just another instant coffee, it was marketed as the upgrade. But here's why Nescafe did it. It wasn't just about improving the product, it was about capturing a different market segment. Nestle knew that there were consumers who were slowly outgrowing basic instant coffee, and others were starting to slowly embrace the new cafe culture. And so they just saw that there was this growing group of people that saw that instant coffee was no longer enough. And so without a premium option, Nescafe risked losing them. And that's why they launched Nescafe Gold. This solved that problem by giving these consumers a reason to stay inside the brand. Despite this, in the 1980s, a new challenge was rising. As I mentioned, cafe culture was spreading. People weren't just drinking their coffees anymore, they were going for the experience of the cafe. It was a bit of a shift as to how people saw coffee. So once again, Nestle and Nescafe had a choice. Do they just allow people to graduate out of instant coffee entirely? Or do they try to figure out and give them a way to have that cafe experience at home? And that's how they ended up making Nespresso. What's interesting about Nespresso is that the people who love it don't just drink coffee, they enjoy the tiny ritual that comes with it. Like there's something almost ceremonial about it. Starting from that neat little parade of metallic pods lined up on a rack, color-coded, organized, and displayed like a collection. For a lot of Nespresso users, the machine became a centerpiece in their kitchen. It's the appliance they're proud to show off because quite honestly, it's a beautiful machine. It's sleek, it's modern, it tells people who visit your home that you take your coffee seriously, but not in a complicated way. And that's why Nespresso works. It sells convenience, but wrapped in ritual. It sells simplicity, but wrapped in style. It sells coffee, but really, it sells identity. Nespresso was aspirational, but it was also expensive. Nestle introduced another tier, Dolce Gusto. It's the same pod system, but more playful, more colorful, more versatile. They did this because the danger for Nestle was obvious. If people kept upgrading their taste outside of home, they might eventually leave instant coffee behind. Nespresso and Dolce Gusto ensured that as people's tastes evolved, they stayed within Nespresso's ecosystem. But if Nespresso and Dolce Gusto was solving the at-home cafe experience, there was still one more challenge. People were falling in love with brands, not just the coffee, but the identity behind the coffee they drank. And at that time, no brand had a heavier emotional pull than Starbucks. So instead of trying to out-Starbucks, Nescafe did something smarter. In 2018, Nestle struck a $7 billion deal to create the Starbucks at Home line. This gave them the rights to sell Starbucks beans, instant mixes, and pods in supermarkets. It was a simple idea. Why fight for a category that Starbucks already owned when you could partner with them and bring the brand straight into people's kitchens? And honestly, the deal just made as much sense to Starbucks as it did for Nestle. Starbucks was never built for the grocery aisle. Their strength was in the in-store experience. The smell, the ambiance, the barista calling your name wrong. We didn't have decades of know-how in making products specifically designed for at-home brewing, and Nestle did. So instead of competing with Nescafe in a space where Starbucks was weak, Starbucks got to partner with a giant who already mastered that entire world. Nestle handled everything from formulation to packaging to logistics, while Starbucks simply let the power of its brand. It was the easiest way for Starbucks to enter millions of homes without needing to build an entire division from scratch. And Nescafe benefited as well. Instead of seeing Starbucks as a threat that's pulling people away from instant coffee at home, they turned that threat into a revenue stream. Starbucks expanded its reach beyond physical stores, and Nestle expanded its coffee empire with one of the most beloved brands on the planet. But if Starbucks represented the mainstream coffee crowd, Nestle also moved on the extreme end of the coffee universe. They acquired a stake in Blue Bottle Coffee, one of the most respected names in Third Wave. Now, if you're not familiar, Third Wave is basically a movement where they treat coffee like a craft. They focus on single origins, artisanal roasting, ethical sourcing. They're basically on the opposite end of mass production. And one of the best brands in Third Wave at that time was Blue Bottle. And Blue Bottle was everything Nescafe wasn't, but that was exactly the point. And one of the reasons why Blue Bottle meant so much was because of the type of crowd that it attracted. Blue Bottle didn't have customers, they had super fans. And Blue Bottle built all that trust by being uncompromising. They were the type where every detail was very deliberate and intentional. And that level of commitment created this brand that money can't buy. Nestle understood the value of that. Blue Bottle wasn't just another cafe chain, it was a cultural signal. By investing in it, Nestle tapped into a group of consumers who would never go near instant coffee, but who still influenced how the world talked about coffee. Nestle knew that they couldn't manufacture that kind of authenticity. So instead of building an artisanal brand from scratch, they invested in Blue Bottle and gained credibility in a segment that would never reach for Nescafe. And now you start to see the whole picture. The Starbucks partnership attracted the everyday coffee lover. The Blue Bottle investment gave them credibility with the purists. Together, those two moves covered both ends of the cultural spectrum. Even if specialty coffee stayed small with this move, Nestle hedged its bet. And if things did well and Third Wave took over, well, Nestle already had its foot in the door. And with that, Nestle closed the last major gaps in their coffee empire. So when you zoom out, you start to see the real picture. Nestle didn't just sell instant coffee, it built an empire, a ladder, a complete coffee ecosystem that met people at every stage of their taste. From the budget instant coffee sachets we all grew up with, to the cafe-style pod machines in Nespresso and Dolce Gusto, to Starbucks on supermarket shelves, all the way to the third wave crowd through Blue Bottle, no matter where global coffee culture moved, Nestle already had a bet there. And that's how Nescafe held the throne for decades. It was all about adaptability. Whenever the world changed its relationship with coffee, Nescafe found a way to stay in the conversation. That's how they built their lead. But here's the twist. In the Philippines, that lead didn't last forever. Because somewhere in Indonesia, a smaller, hungrier competitor was watching. A brand that didn't have Nestle's money, Nestle's power, or Nestle's global dominance. And so they relied heavily on outsmarting the global coffee giant. And they doubled down on figuring out a flavor profile that didn't come from Switzerland but from Southeast Asia itself. That brand was Kopiko, and that's what we're gonna talk about in the next episode. And that's it. Now you know about the brand origin story of Nescafe. If you want to sponsor an episode or if you want to be featured, the links are in the description. My website's right there. Just message me and then we can work something out. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok. I have shorter clips there. My name is Chris. I'll see you in the next one.